when you see the production curve, is working the microphone? Yeah, yeah. When you see the production curve for different crops, for some of them it's a straight line, for instance wheat, but for others it's a curvilinear line. It's a curvilinear, including olive. In these cases, depends on your production target, but if you are looking for maximum yield, probably you have to irrigate as much as possible to cover the whole crop water demand. But if you are looking for maximum profit, you don't have to go so high with irrigation. And this is because the amount of water that you have to put at the end of the production curve doesn't pay for the small increase in production of the crop. Okay, so in those cases, deficit irrigation is the best option to produce these crops. Among the different deficit irrigation strategies that has been defined for olive trees, you have there a summary. You have enough water. You normally use irrigation above the allowable depletion threshold, but you don't have such a high amount of water to irrigate. Usually you use a greater, more severe deficit irrigation strategy, including sustained deficit irrigation, regulated deficit irrigation, which are very common in olive orchards. So, full irrigation, actually you estimate the irrigation requirements based on the crop water demand minus the effective precipitation. In this case, if you irrigate like that, you will keep the soil water content very close to field capacity, but this is a pity because the crop will not use the water stored in the soil, what we call the allowable depletion, before going to allowable depletion threshold, which is when the crop starts suffering because of water stress. So we never use full irrigation in Spain because there is no point. What we do is recommended irrigation, what we call recommended irrigation, in which the irrigation requirements you calculate them in the same way, but take into account the water stored in the soil. By doing that, you can save, well, you have there, for instance, the consumption of water for irrigation of different olive orchards with different densities. In my area, in South Spain, and if you use the recommended irrigation, as you can see, you can save in between 15 and 20% of the irrigation total doses. Well, you know, most of you should know sustained deficit irrigation, which consists on applying just a fraction of the irrigation requirements all along the crop growing cycle. Your choice is regulated deficit irrigation. What you do is you study the crop tolerance to water stress, and you define the moments of the phenological stage at which your crop is more or less tolerant to water stress. In this case, for the olive tree, the moments in which the crop needs more water is around bloom, also at the beginning of the maximum rate of pit hardening period, and then after the summer. So in this moment, we irrigate to 100 or very close to 100 irrigation requirements if the available water in the soil is below a certain depletion degree. Okay. In those cases, we apply daily irrigation, and for the rest of the year, usually we apply just one irrigation per week, 2 irrigations per week, or depending on the rainfall. And by doing that, you save 40, 50, or even more total irrigation amount. It is not clear which one of these two techniques is more profitable for olives. The literature doesn't have consensus here, but the good point or the thing is that to apply any of them, you have to know the evapotranspiration, the crop evapotranspiration. So how do you calculate or estimate crop evapotranspiration in commercial orchards? Well, this takes us to the next part of my presentation, which is dealing with the Allen and Pereira approach. Usually in commercial orchards, you can use the crop coefficient approach, which is very simple. And a few years ago, Ricky Allen and Luis Santos Pereira, they developed what we call the Allen Pereira approach, which is much more complicated. It's not, it's much more mechanistic. It's not as empirical on the crop coefficient approach. Actually, this approach is based on the dual crop coefficient. You have to measure in the orchard the time course of the ground cover, the tree height, and wind speed and relative humidity in the orchard. And also to run this approach, you need estimation of soil evapotranspiration, soil evaporation and leaf resistance. But this information is relatively easy to get by the farmers. So what we did was a study to compare the two approaches. Actually, we worked with a randomized block design in a super high density olive orchard in my area in the years 2023 and 24. My area is at the south of Spain, very close to the city of Seville, over there. Okay, and we published very recently a paper in which we describe the experiments that we did in 23 and 24. So you want more details, you can have a look at this paper. Basically, what we did was on the first year, 23, we ran the Allen Pereira approach by following the instruction from the authors. They have a table that and they also provide some estimation for olive of evaporation from the soil and the leaf resistance, the value of the leaf resistance. So we check the performance of the irrigation by using the table as compared to the crop coefficient approach. Oh, it's not coming properly. Sorry. Oh, it's not, it should be the full graphs, but they are not appearing here. I don't know why. Maybe there's some incompatibility. But this is a real pity because you will not see the dynamics of the crop evapotranspiration and so on. There is a problem with the system. Anyway, the important information is right there. So we tested the crop coefficient versus the Allen Pereira on the 2023, and we find out that the Allen Pereira approach overestimated by nearly 30% the crop water requirements, the irrigation requirements. So we did a sensitivity analysis to see which one of the factors within the equations were those having a greater weight. And it happens that it was the leaf resistance. So what we did for the next year, for 2024, is to use a model to estimate daily the leaf resistance in our orchard. The model was based was originally developed by Buckley, but we use a version of the model developed by Antonio Díaz Espejo, is a researcher from my group, adapted for olive trees. And then we also obtain better estimation of soil evaporation by using a model developed by some colleagues from the University of Córdoba, Francisco Orgaz et al. But the problem with this model was that it was not validated for super high density olive orchards, okay, but for conventional orchards. Well, this is a real pity. The graphs are not appearing. Anyway. I hope that I don't have too many slides with the graphs, but I don't know why they are not, we cannot see them. Anyway, the next year in 2024, after doing these two improvements, we got a much better approach, all right? So, a much better agreement between, so we improved the Allen Pereira approach, but you see that there still was some difference. So, what we decided to do in 2025 was to use an improved version of the model of stomatal conductance. This is my colleague Antonio Espejo. And this paper, this is the model, the original model, the model app, the equation app that we use for the 2023 and 24 experiments. And this is the improved model. And this model has been validated for our orchard conditions. And also, we are using an improved model on soil evaporation, right? So by doing that, we are using the Ritchie model, the classical Ritchie model, but validated for our conditions. For doing that, we use microlysimeters installed in different parts of the orchard, below the meters, below the trees, in between the tree rows and so on. So we have validated the model, and in the years 2025 and 2026, we are going to run these improvements. Okay, let's go and see the third part of my chart, optimal irrigation. You remember that figure, and the crucial point is where in the curve is this point recommending irrigation. So this is crucial information to know how much water we should apply through irrigation. Now, how can you find this point? Where in the curve is the point? Well, we use different approaches. The first approach, we did some economic analysis to find where was the point for, not for maximum production, but for maximum profit, okay? And in one experiment that we did with data from the years 2015 to 2020, we published that paper in 2020, we found out that the 2 points were very close, but they were very close because they will be far away if the grower is paid by quality, if the electricity is expensive, and if the water is expensive. In this case, you get a point of maximum productivity quite below the point of maximum yield. But in our case, both the electricity and the water was not expensive, and the grower was not paid by quality, but by quantity. So in this case, you get the 2 points very close. This kind of analysis, they are very useful for the farmer, because imagine that the farmer has a very low amount of water. So this question is a question that every farmer have themselves. How should we manage this amount of water? To apply full irrigation to a reduced fraction of moisture, or to apply deficit irrigation to a greater surface area of moisture? So we did some analysis. For our example was a 10 hectares olive orchard with a water allocation of 1,500 cubic meters per hectare. And by using this approach, we were able to find that there were 2 possible options for getting maximum production: to irrigate 3.9 hectares with the maximum amount of water, 3,800 cubic meters per hectare, or to irrigate 5.7 with a reduced amount of water. Okay? But these data were for the Spanish condition for this period, so they have to be extrapolated for different conditions. Okay, another way of finding where in the curve is this point, but what we call the stomatal conductance approach. You see that the curve between, or the relationship between stomatal conductance and photosynthesis is a proxy of the production curve. So I can find here the value of the stomatal conductance which delivers the maximum yield, and the value of the stomatal conductance which produces the maximum profit in the orchard, right? So I used the model developed by my colleague Antonio Díaz-Espejo to find out the value of this targeted stomatal conductance, so I can irrigate the orchard based on that value. So what we do is we measure the stomatal conductance in the orchard, and if it is above or below this targeted value, we rate the irrigation doses. Now you can tell me, but measuring stomatal conductance is very complicated. Well, it is not anymore, because another researcher from my team, Dr. Virginia Santana, she developed a way of estimating or deriving stomatal conductance based on subflow measurements. The subflow measurements are automatically made. So actually, the stomatal conductance is a function of the subflow density obtained from the subflow measurements and the BPD of the air. Okay, so we don't use IRGAS anymore, but we use subflow measurements to derive in real time the stomatal conductance in the orchard. Now, stomatal conductance is not the only physiological variable that we are dealing with. Also, the work of Virginia, she is working with leaf turgor by using the thin probes. Okay, she's monitoring the leaf turgor, and there is a very close relationship between fruit growth and leaf turgor about a certain threshold, which is the line that it is drawn here. So instead of stomatal conductance, you can use leaf turbo because it's very closely related to the maximum production of the orchard, because it's very closely related to fruit growth. Or if you want a simple approach, you can use the model to find out which is the value of the allowable depletion threshold and which is the value of the stomatal conductance corresponding to this allowable depletion threshold in your orchard. And you can calculate it easily by using a pedotransfer function. For instance, we use Rosetta, right? So by using this approach, you keep always the amount of water exactly or very close to the allowable depletion threshold in the orchard. Well, as you can imagine, this kind of methodologies, they are not for normal producers because they require some training and they require understanding physiological processes. So in order to the farmers to benefit from these methodologies, we develop a decision support system called Isadora Plus, in which we include the three approaches, the Allen and Pereira method, the mechanistic model, this is the stomatal conductance models, and also a first approach that I haven't speaking to you today about that is the control of irrigation, the scheduling of irrigation based on trunk diameter variations or leaf turbo measurements, right? And we can use the model, and in the end, to the farmer just appear very easy instructions in her or his mobile phone. Every day we can send instructions to the farmer. So they can benefit for a complicated methodology without requiring or without having any specialized training. And now let's move to the last part of my talk, the irrigation under persistent drought. Well, this situation here is a real situation. We have it in my area. This is the Andalusia area where I live. And we have a 5 years drought from 2019 to 2023. And look how dramatically the water allocations were reduced to the farmers. So the people in charge of ordering the water allocation, which is the Guadalquivir River Basin Confederation, they consult us what happens if with such a low water allocation, will the trees die? How this small irrigation will affect the production of the orchard in the following years? So what we find in the literature is that depending on the intensity of the plant density, this so-called survival irrigation has to be something like that. Survival irrigation means for the trees not to die and to ensure that the negative impact of the drought this year is not going to penalize very much the development in the long term of the orchard, right? So we estimate from the literature these values, but we didn't have experimental procedures. So in the years 2023 and 24, I ran 2 experiments with what we call survival irrigation. We just supply 20% of the total irrigation amounts, and then the following year, half than that, 10%. So in this case, well, this is the sort of figure that was missing from my previous slide. Okay, the time course of the crop evapotranspiration, the potential evapotranspiration, the water allocation that we apply with the irrigations, and the soil water contents. And we analyze also the impact of this reduced amount of water in crop performance. Basically, for instance, here you have the shoot length, the 2 years, and you have the production. Look to the production in the first year. Well, the difference was not so great, still quite significant, of course, but the following year we got quite lower, a greater impact on the amount of fruits. Okay. So, based on that, we derive instruction on what to do for years of persistent drought. Before planting, you have to choose the right combination of rootstock and cultivar. The rootstock has to be vigorous in order to explore as much as possible the soil, but the cultivar has to be of reduced vigor, because if you have no water, but you have a tree with a large leaf area, you are in trouble. Okay, so the leaf area has to be controlled. Then maybe you have to evaluate whether you have to increase artificially the water retention of your soil or not by using amendments. And basically you have to reduce plant density. So super high olive orchard, they go from 1,500 trees to 2,000 trees per hectare, and this is not sustainable under drought conditions. So we propose a smaller plant density, like this one, for instance. After planting, well, drip is better than micro sprinklers, of course, to reduce evaporation. Underground irrigation, well, it depends. I am not a fan of underground irrigation, but maybe it can be suitable under long droughts. You have to increase pruning intensity to reduce the leaf area, but you have to be very careful not to unbalance the orchard, careful with the pruning. You have to do as much as possible to reduce the number of fruits, because they demand a lot of water if the year is becoming very dry. Despite of the fact of you are going to lose production that year, but you are going to ensure that the tree will survive properly for the next year. And then, well, not to irrigate a flowering, for instance, to reduce the number of fruits, and then manage the orchard cover. Okay, once again, this slide has been a little bit unarranged. Okay, so I think that we are more or less, past a few minutes, but well, the work that I show you here is a product of formatting, of course. So you have any question, you will be very welcome. Yes? Yeah, okay. Yes, Peter? Yeah. You have to validate the model, the stomatal conductance model for each variety. I mean, in some cases the difference will be not really big, but in other cases, yes. Especially if we are talking about varieties of the same area, maybe the differences are not very big. But if you want to use our model in your place in Argentina, I will not ensure that the model is going to deliver the right value for you, for your conditions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you
very much. The next presentation will be given by Uri Hochberg from Volcani Institute. Irrigation in olive tree, thinking about varietal differences in growth adaptation. It's okay. No. No. Okay. No, it's okay.
טסטינג. שומעים את זה? You hear me? You hear me? Okay. So happy to be here, and I'm gonna present. Well, I can't hear myself, so I'm gonna move to the other side. Do I need to stand in front of this camera? Does it matter? Project that we ended like 3 years ago, when you can see that Arnon on the authors list, because he actually initiated this. I started my lab like 7 years ago. I work in plant hydraulics, and Arnon, just when I started, he approached me and he said, I want to study water relations in olives, and specifically I'm interested in the differences between different cultivars. And we took Oded Barzilai, this guy, and this is what everything I'm going to show you is his master project. I was actually intrigued by olive hydraulics as soon as Arnon approached me, because they are very exceptional crops. Okay, they are very unique in the values and the drought level which they can achieve. And I'm going to show you a side project of Oded just to give this as an example. So Oded, I need to be. Okay. So we took an orchard that was cut down. This is near Volcani Center in Rishon LeZion. It's a Mediterranean area. It's Arbequina trees. There's 500 millimeters in the winter, even a bit more. But it was cut down, and only one row or 3 rows of trees were left. And we decided to monitor them because irrigation stopped, and we suspected that the drought level will be very significant, okay? Because these were quite developed trees and fairly large with a high water consumption, and suddenly there is no irrigation. And I have to go there. Okay. זה לא עובד בכלל. So as you can see, the water potentials were indeed very, very low. Okay, minus 8 megapascal is, to me, an unheard of value for a crop. Yeah, this is something people grow for cash. It's not an expedition to the Atacama Desert. And if you think these values are irrelevant or anything like that, and I'm giving an irrelevant case here. So this is what we got this year. It's not we, it's actually from Arnon and Yafit Cohen and Ofer Rosenstein. They have this monitoring in the north of Israel. And you can see the evolution of water potential this year, because we had a very, very dry winter with about half the precipitation than normal, like 2,500 instead of 5,000 per hectare. And the soil water potential at the end of August is, again, below minus 7 megapascal. So these are relevant values. If we go, by the way, further south in Israel, where the precipitation, the natural precipitation is lower, so this is Amatya, and trees are dying this year for lack of water. But the interesting thing was not only how low the values are, but if you check the water potential, so in black it's the pre-dawn water potential before sunrise, and there's the afternoon, the lowest value of the day, and there's a difference, quite substantial difference, even when you get to minus 8 megapascal, which suggests that the plants are rehydrating at night. Okay, they are connected somewhat to the soil water reservoir, and they're evaporating during the day, so they're active. If you look at stomal conductance, so 0.05 is way above residual values. Okay, also if you think about carbon assimilation, so it's positive. Okay, if you keep drying plants, virtually every species you'll dry to such value, if it's not dead, will be on what we call residual conductance, which is 20% of this value, and assimilation will probably be negative. So they are very unique, and part of it is because their unique ability to accumulate solids. Okay, they have to maintain turgor. This is the solid potential throughout the year, and you can see that it becomes very, very high in the summer. At the top, panel A is the native solid potential, and at the bottom is what it's after we rehydrated the leaf, because everything becomes more concentrated if you dry it, right? Even a towel will become more, the concentration will increase when you dry it, but here everything is wet, and what you see here is active osmotic adjustment, the accumulation of solids, typically sugar and sugar alcohols. And again, you can see quite substantial differences between pre-dawn values and midday values, because there is photosynthesis and there is accumulation of sugars during the day. And this, I want to plug in our journal, because we published this in a Journal of Plant Hydraulics, which I want to recommend to you. Maybe you want to submit your futures papers to, because I'm currently the editor. And but I wasn't when we published this. It's free for the authors and for the readers. It's sponsored by Enrique. And I want to point how unique these values are. So I have in my lab now a new PhD student, Bogale, and he's working on osmotic adjustment. So I asked him to show me a survey of all the families of what's the solid concentration. And Oleaceae, the family of olives, it's the most highest concentration that we found. By the way, it's not only olives. So in Israel we have Filaria and Barzite, if you know this a native species, which also accumulates very, very high concentration. They do sugar alcohols, inositol, very high concentration of inositol. Also in terms of, by the way, vulnerability to embolism, so this is from a review of Brandon Choate. So these are the angiosperms, and if you look the psi 50, the value of 50% loss of conductivity from the group of Enrique. There is a Celia and Torres that measure these values, and also the minimal water potential. You see it's also kind of in the end of the spectrum. And again, it's very interesting that it's in the end of the spectrum, both in terms of solid potential and in resistance to embolism, because it's a crop. It's not an expedition to a desert. And with this unique hydraulics, Arnon came and asked the question, so why are different cultivars behave differently? And he specifically asked about the Barnea and the Suri. Alon and Arnon had this experiment where they found that the Barnea has a very drastic reduction in production when you reduce the irrigation, and the Suri doesn't. The Suri is the native kind of cultivar of Israel, grown here for hundreds of years. And the hypothesis was that maybe all of what I showed you, the hydraulics, the accumulation of solutes, and the vulnerability to embolism is improved in the Suri, and therefore it can sustain under drier soils. Okay, that was basically the hypothesis. And Oded, again, it's his project. You can see him here with his pot. So he planted a lot of Suri and a lot of Barnea. He grew them in our net house. And he allowed them to dry until they reach catastrophic values in terms of FV over FM. Some kind of photosynthetic parameters that signifies that the trees are soon to be, the leaves will die at least. So you see that in the this dashed line is when the FE over FM threshold was achieved. In the Barnea it happened in -6 megapascal. In the Suri it happened in -7 or even lower megapascal. And we thought that this is a good indication that it's more tolerant to stress. And also this is pressure volume parameters. So you can see here at the top it's elasticity. Okay, elasticity, it's the relationship between the stem water potential and the available or the relative water content of the leaf. You can see that when you get to -5 megapascal, a dry stem water potential, so the Suri has a higher relative water content of about 80%, and the Barnea 10 or 15% lower. And again, plants don't like to lose water. When they lose water and they shrink, it starts damage if the shrinking is that significant. Also in terms of solid potential, just as expected, the Suri has more solids, okay? Higher concentration of solids, so that's why it can sustain lower water potentials. And I have here the regression to show you that the reduction in FV over FM in the Barnea occurs at -5 or 6 megapascal, and in the Suri only at -7. But eventually what matters is how much water is in the soil, okay? And you can see that actually both of them lose their FE over FM rates at very similar soil water content. It's not really that the Suri can sustain lower soil water contents. And that's partially because it's a very steep relationship, okay? The relationship between the soil water content and the stem water potential. So the fact that the Suri was able to go to an extra 1 megapascal or 1.5 megapascal gives very, very little water. It's the difference between 21% and 20%. It doesn't really give you a lot for your production. And if you think about stomal conductance closure, so we thought that the reduction in stomal conductance, the Suri should be able to maintain it at lower water potential, but this was not the case. The reduction is quite similar for both. If anything at all, the Barnea has higher values at lower stem water potential. But the interesting part here is look at Barnea stomal conductance. It's always higher under well-watered conditions. Okay, and this is part of the story, part of the answer. But before I'm going to go to this answer, I want to show you that also in terms of xylem vulnerability, this is with the rehydration kinetics method. So you can see the reduction of the twig hydraulic conductance with respect to the stem water potential. So the reduction is faster in the Suri. So actually the Suri is more vulnerable to hydraulic dysfunction. But again, what stands up from this figure is that the Barnea is much higher hydraulic conductivity, all throughout the whole range. And this high hydraulic conductivity is because it has larger vessels. Okay, we did the cross sections, and you can see here the histograms. So the average for the Barnea is 9 micrometer, the diameter of the vessels, and for the Suri it's smaller, it's 8. So basically, the Barnea has larger vessels and more conductance, therefore it supports more stomal conductance and assimilation, more transpiration, therefore it also gives more yield. But it also consumes the water faster, okay? So it's not really the question of tolerating drought, it's more avoidance from drought, okay? Differently from what we expected. If you go back again to this initial figure I showed you, so they both reached eventually the same soil water content when the damage occurred. It's just that the Barnea reduction of the available water was faster as compared with the Suri. So the take-home message is that, first of all, olives are highly adapted to drought and they perform in values which other crops typically don't. The Suri doesn't have improved tolerance to low soil water content, okay, differently from what we thought. Instead, it's kind of a water management strategy rather than tolerance to drought. And avoidance, if you look at the literature in general, it's typically avoidance. Plants that can sustain very dry conditions avoid the drought rather than somehow tolerate it. And that's it. If anyone has any questions, we out there with this study. Also the question that was presented to me, study from Alon, where the study from Alon, where they found that it's in response to water deficit, the different responses. That there's a much sharper decline in the Barnea compared with the Suri. So that was the initial question, focus of water. I'm not sure. I don't know about anything about flowering or stuff like that. Yes. Right. Right, in a big, yeah, it's a classical problem with the pots, and we still do a pots experiment because that's what we can typically. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, thank you very much, Uri. So we are moving from water stress to salinity stress. He said that he solved the problem, and he didn't do it. And I'm happy to invite Alon Ben Gal from Volcani Institute to speak about olive tree cultivar Barnea response to irrigation water salinity, revealing mechanism and guiding management. Thank you, Alon.
Saw it before, so I know it's here. So we'll switch a little bit and talk about salinity. That's it. I think I probably got this. So I'm gonna read it. They need it for the Zoom. Okay. Hello, Zooms. Okay, so we're growing olives. As olives become modernized, it involves new varieties that are very vigorous and highly producing, and it involves things like heavy pruning and mechanical harvesting, and especially irrigation and fertilization. As those things came into modern olive harvesting, people in the desert areas realized, hey, we can grow them too. We know how to irrigate and fertilize, and we can do all those things. Why not grow this crop that, especially because we understand that it's so tolerant or hardy and able to grow in under different kinds of stress conditions. So growing olives in the desert has been happening for a while, successfully with good yields. In areas where water scarcity has forced the growers to use very poor quality water. So we're talking about salinity that's irrigation induced, with as high as the electrical conductivities as high as 4 and 5 decisiemens per meter, typically being used to irrigate these olives. Now, when we look at the literature, we see that a couple different things. One, that we understand that olives are moderately tolerant. That's talking about a threshold and the slope of the response curve. It doesn't really say that very much to us. We know that they're fairly tolerant, though. We also know that there's differences between varieties. Apparently, response to salinity is very cultivar specific, and there's doing it. Part of the mechanism is apparently avoiding having problematic salts not reach sensitive organs. So there's some kind of exclusion mechanism that's happening that's keeping the salts out of the leaves and the upper parts of the trees. Now, most of the studies that we see that had happened on olives and salinity were pot studies, with all the problems of pot studies on young trees, usually not bearing trees. We set out to understand whole tree response of bearing olives to this. We worked with Barnea. Again, I just said there's differences between cultivars, so we're concentrating on the Israeli modern cultivar that's become very popular and important here in Israel. We did it in lysimeters. We understood that salinity that the plant sees is in the root zone, and that root zone salinity can come from different sources. It can be the salinity of the irrigation water that we're irrigating with, but it also can be because of how much we're irrigating. If we irrigate more, and more than what the plant needs, then we will leach out some of those salts and keep the salinity different than otherwise. So we set up an experiment that had both causes of salinity. So 5 different irrigation salinity levels, from very low, 0.5 decisiemens per meter, to very high, over 10 decisiemens per meter, with a fixed leaching fraction, which is 140 times the amount of water that the plants were using. And at the same time, it's not moving. At the same time, we would give with a pretty high salinity, our typical salinity in these desert regions, but pretty high, we would give different leaching fractions, from almost no leaching to quite a bit of leaching over what the plants. You did this in lysimeters that allow us to do a water and solute balance. These are weighing drainage lysimeters, and we're able to calculate daily evapotranspiration out of knowing very simply what goes in, irrigation and precipitation, what comes out by measuring the drainage, and the change in weight is the change in storage of the water inside the lysimeters. We looked at water and salt balance. We looked at tree growth and fruit and oil yield. We looked at some of what we have in our toolbox for plant physiology, and we looked a lot at roots because we understood that probably the mechanisms for salt response are happening at the roots, so we paid a lot of attention to the roots in this study. These are results. This is the accumulated daily evapotranspiration on per treatment, and we can see over 2.5 years, there's 3 summers within these graphs. You see winters that are flatter and summers where the water use is more, and we see very clearly the differentiation and the effects of the treatments on water use. Now, water use, evapotranspiration, can be 3 things. First thing is the size of the canopy. Second thing is the weather. And the third thing is physiology and plant response. So we're seeing those things together, mostly plant size. We're seeing an effect on the size of the trees over time that is affecting the relative amount of water that they're being used. And we see the effect of salinity very strongly. We see the effect of the leaching also very strongly. Very low leaching is giving us smaller trees, higher salts, smaller trees, and the same kind of effect. And when we reach a certain amount of leaching from 140% above, then we're not seeing any differences. When we take the accumulated amounts of this and we get a response curve to salinity. Now ECE here, ECE is saturated paste electrical conductivity. It's a normalized way to look at the salts of the root zone, and in this case it's time and profile averaged. So this is the average salinity that each of these treatments would see over time, over 3 years. And the response, and by the 2 different ways that we were causing the irrigation-induced salinity, we get this kind of a response curve with a pretty serious jump from the lowest salinity to the next salinity that we have, which is a bit surprising because the literature tells us there's a threshold. And we certainly don't see any threshold in these results. We see very similar curves, response curves, when we look at the same thing for other measures of growth and biomass. So whether that's the trunk cross-sectional area, which represents overall total growth very well when you measure increases in trunk circumference, or if that's the total biomass at the end, above ground biomass at the end of the experiment when we took down the trees. Fruit and oil yield were more linear responses. The fruit yield mostly by numbers of fruit. By having bigger trees that grow more, you have more fruit. The percent oil increased a little bit as a function of salinity, but not enough to change the nature of the response curve for the oil. We were able to take these and model and feed them into a salinity response curve that allows us to then feed that into models of plant response and see both the plant response to salinity, but more important to get the kind of water response, water production curves that we saw previously from Enrique. This is a function of salinity of the irrigation water. These curves give us a couple different interesting things. One, irrigating with salty water is problematic. We're going to have lower biomass production, and as long as we understand that fruit yield is somehow related to biomass production, we're going to have lower yields from that. We need to leach in order to maximize production, and maybe more importantly, the whole even thinking about deficit irrigation makes no sense when you have salts in the system, because you're going to drive the yields very low and doing it, and you're not going to be able to leach the salts and maintain the production that you want. Physiological results. We want to try to look a little bit into mechanisms and try to understand these responses and where they're coming from. So midday stem water potential linearly decreases as a function of increased salinity of the root zone. The crop water stress index is a measure based on thermal imaging. The canopy temperature is a little bit of a proxy of stomatal conductance. So what we're seeing here is higher stomatal conductance or lower crop water stress index as when you have less salinity in the system. The photosynthesis is a little more complicated, and I guess that's not surprising either based on the figures we saw from Uri as well. I want to get into the roots. I think the roots are going to tell us a better story about what's happening. We looked at roots both by having mini rhizotrons. Is Yoni in the room? Yoni's here, but he didn't come to the talk. With Yoni Efrat, we put in tubes where we could put in cameras. We could take pictures of the roots, and we could follow root growth and turnover over time. We also dissected and excavated roots at the end of the experiment and sampled them, and were able to both measure them quantitatively and qualitatively. And I'm missing figures too, so you can feel good about yours. We're going to see the response curves to those things that look like the response curves of the other things that we were seeing of the growth, but even more extreme between the first two levels. The most response was between the lowest salinity, which is very low, and the next salinity, which was based on irrigating a large amount of 2 decisiemens per meter water. And we're not seeing these graphs as well, but believe me, when I summarize and say that when we increase the salinity, we have lower amounts of roots, a bigger diameter, average diameter of a root, lower root length density, and less root area. So we looked for where the salts were. So sodium and chloride are what are most interesting to us as the bad salts. And we found something very interesting. One, that in the roots we saw increase of these salts, of these ions, as a function of increase of exposure to salinity. But what's even more interesting is we found higher levels of salts in the younger roots. So first order roots, which are the very youngest roots, and here I had a picture too that didn't come through. Oh, here. So the very youngest roots have the highest amounts of concentrations of sodium and chloride in them. Now if we compare that to what we find in the leaves, so these are diagnostic leaves, we also see some increase of the sodium and the chloride in the leaves as a function of increased exposure to salinity, but it's orders of magnitude less. If you look at the y-axis, 2 orders of magnitude less concentration of the sodium and the chloride in the leaves as in the roots. So we really are starting to see that we have some kind of an exclusion mechanism that at the root level that's keeping the salts out of the upper part of the trees. So we went even farther with the roots. We excavated roots. This work with Ron and a postdoc, and also we're not seeing the figures, and they're nice figures, so it's a shame. But here we see confirmation when sampled and scanned the roots that yes, we have a higher root diameter and lower specific length. But when we went to the microscope and really looked closely at cross-sections of these roots, and these are young, viable roots, comparing low salinity on the left and high salinity on the right, we're seeing some structural differences in the anatomy of these roots. And that comes down to, as salinity increases, we have smaller vascular cylinders. We have a bigger with cortex with a higher number of cells. We see a smaller xylem area, but with larger vessels. We use the scanning electron microscope also to look for the salts within the root, and we saw that they were being concentrated in very certain places around the periderm. So these peaks that we're seeing in these graphs, that's the amount of sodium, and from the distance, as a function of distance from the center, I think, of the root, and we're seeing these peaks where these salts are being stopped. So the periderm is compartmentalization of the sodium, and it's serving as a block, as an area that's blocking the roots. Now I just want to finish the story by coming back to the mini rhizotrons. We're able to look at these pictures that we see at the soil surface where the roots are growing along these tubes that we're accessing and taking pictures from them. And we see a cycle of roots that are white to turning gray to turning brown to turning black. White roots are functioning, active, and important. Black roots are dead. So we're able to then quantify the amount of living roots and the amount of dead roots as a function of the salinity, and we see that both over time that those things change, and more importantly, as salinity goes up, we have less of the white, active, important roots, and more of the black, dead roots. So we have a higher turnover of roots as a function of higher salinity, suggesting that this is a mechanism for handling. The roots are taking up the salts, stopping them, not letting them into the xylem, stopping at the periderm, and then dying faster to get rid of them so they're not in the plant anymore and not causing problems. Anyway, we found that Barnea olive growth and water use declined significantly as a function of root zone salinity increase. The results in the modeling suggest that deficit irrigation with water containing salts is a real bad idea and very problematic. We can't use those strategies when we're under conditions of salinity. The mechanisms for salt tolerance, or I think it's better to talk about physiological responses to salinity rather than tolerance. Tolerance is often survivability, and that's not interesting to us. What's interesting is the response. They occur at the root level, and as potentially toxic ions are excluded nearly absolutely. The greatest effect of salinity on roots is when comparing with the very lowest levels. The youngest roots have the highest concentrations of sodium and chloride, and what we find is this increased periderm sodium chloride barrier, smaller xylem area, increased vessel diameter, and increased conductivity with it. And root, as I said in the last slide, root mortality is really a mechanism for salt tolerance by being able to exclude and get rid of those salts ultimately from the trees. These we've been published. There's also, we're going to hear from Zipora in the next talk about how the salinity affects oil and oil quality. You're welcome to visit the publications that have come out of this study. I want to recognize students and collaborators and places and people who helped fund and make these possible, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Time for one question.
It's a great question. It was for a while. It depends on olive prices more than almost anything else. It also depends on the price of water. So if the water is cheap enough and you can afford to irrigate enough to meet the salts, and olive prices are high enough, then there was about 10 years where these were highly profitable. What happened was olive prices in the world then went down. The farmers had very little room for playing economically. You either cut off your personnel and the people you're hiring, or you lower the amount of water. Once the farmers started irrigating less, then they went into a downward spiral and were in real trouble, and it wasn't economically. Okay, and that may be reversing today, but it really comes down to oil prices.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alon. And as Alon said, the next presentation will be speaking about the quality parameters of using saline water for irrigation. It will be given by Zipora Tietel from Volcani Institute. The title of the presentation will be Saline Water Irrigation Affect Olive Oil Chemical, Nutritional and Sensorial Quality.
Okay, so hello. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. And I will speak. I will present today, after a short introduction, results from two experiments. One experiment is the one that Alon has just introduced with the lysimeters and saline water irrigation, and the other one is a long-term response for olive cultivars in the R&D in Ramat Negev. So actually, olive oil is the most ancient functional food. Although avocado seems to have been a superfood forever, olive oil is actually more ancient. And although some superfoods and some functional foods have been here for a while, olive oil is actually more ancient, and previous cultures have already acknowledged its health-related properties and knew to appreciate its quality and measure it, and also developed very highly technological instruments in order to enjoy it, in order to extract it. And there is a good reason to it, because it has a lot of different beneficial compounds, including those unique polyphenols, the oleocanthal and oleuropein, and which are hydrophilic, and it also has the lipophilic oleic acid and phytosterols. So it has everything, and it's very good, and it's also actually beneficial to all of our biological systems. You name it, any part of the body can benefit from olive oil consumption. If we look at the papers that were showing the beneficial effects in numbers, so everything that is not touching the one line is beneficial, and on top is the cardiovascular disease. So you can see it's very beneficial to prevent cardiovascular diseases, and also if we look at the all-cause mortality. So again, many papers showing that it's good to decrease the overall mortality. And the question is always how much to consume. So if you look at the cardiovascular graphs, so you can see a decrease with increased consumption. So the more you consume, the lower cardiovascular disease people have. When we look at the all-cause mortality, then there is an optimum between 10 and 15 grams per day. Afterwards, it doesn't matter how much olive oil you consume, we all have to die. And with this existential message, we can move on. Another reason olive oil is such a great functional food is it's very tasty. We know, we appreciate its sensory properties. We enjoy consuming it. And last but not least, it looks very good on Instagram. It's a new functional food. It gives you great pictures to your Instagram account. So these days, it's also important. So this is the experiment with the lysimeters that Alon has just presented. So he explained the experimental design, so I don't have to do it. I just want to remind you that there were two salinity irrigation methods and one common control that will also appear. Will my graph appear? Well, no. You will have to believe me too when I tell you these were great graphs. We were able to see that fruit water decreased with increasing salinity, oil content in the fruit increased. We were very happy to see that polyphenols, the hydrophilic content, the hydrophilic compounds of olive oil were increasing and as salinity went higher, irrigation salinity went higher. And we were also happy to see the tocopherols, which are the lipophilic antioxidants in olive oil, were going up with salinity. So these were great data that you can't enjoy, unfortunately. Here there were also the effects on fatty acid composition. So we saw an undesirable increase in decrease in unsaturated 16-1 fatty acid, which is unsaturated fatty acid. We want to consume it, and also a decrease in the 18-3 omega-3 fatty acid of olive oil. We saw an increase in 18-2 to 18-3. You know that in our current nutrition, the ratio of 18-2 to 18-3 is too high, and we want it to be as low as possible. So here we saw an undesirable increase in that. We didn't see any effect in both years and both methods on the oleic acid. So the main fatty acid, beneficial fatty acid of olive oil, was not affected. Oh, pictures. Some quality parameters were not affected by salinity. That was kind of surprising. Antioxidant activity did not change. Carotenoid content did not change. You can also see that the different salinity irrigation methods were not separated, mostly unseparated on PCAs, so it wasn't that significant. So to conclude that, we saw that when we irrigated with increasing salinity, we saw differences in oil composition. We discussed here the economical aspects, so the nutritional aspects should also be taken into consideration. If we start increasing the amounts of olive oil coming from saline irrigation, then we are expecting to see more polyphenols, more tocopherols, but less favorable fatty acid composition. Some I didn't show it, but some of the parameters were affected by the method, so they responded differently depending on the method itself, of the irrigation, saline irrigation method itself. And yeah, we should just keep it in mind as a strategy when we consider saline irrigation. So the next experiment I will show is the Ramat Negev R&D experiment. It was a long-term experiment of field experiment with 11 olive cultivars, and it was irrigated into salinity levels 1.2 and 4.2. And it was interesting that when trees were irrigated with fresh water, they had higher free fatty acid level. Means that they had lower level, lower quality olive. So here again, the salinity irrigation to a certain extent improved the oil quality. You can see it over the various cultivars that these are not all the cultivars, because there was one cultivar which was Picual that did not adhere to that trend. But other than that, it was a very small difference, but it was significant. Same went with polyphenol content. So when trees were irrigated with saline water, they had higher polyphenol levels. Again, better oil quality. And again, this went well with all the cultivars except for Picual. And it also makes sense chemically, because when you have higher polyphenol levels, it makes the oil more oxidative stable, and then and it means that something is supporting this antioxidant activity, and these are the polyphenols. So it makes total sense. In most okay, so the next results I'm gonna present are the sensory data. The fruit were extracted, and oil was extracted from the fruit. And you can see here that in most cultivars there was no effect on fruity attribute of the fruit, of the oil. It was, except for Albertina, it was mostly the same. But for bitter and pungent attributes, you can clearly see that the fresh in blue and saline water irrigation in orange, that saline irrigated oil, or we'll call it oil, had much higher bitterness and much higher pungency, and that goes well with the polyphenol levels. So when the polyphenol levels are higher, the bitterness is higher and the pungency is higher. So it did have significant effect on the fruit, on the oil. I didn't mention, but these are all data from Alon's lab. So to conclude, we can see that in two different experiments there was a significant, sometimes not huge, but significant effect of salinity irrigation on the sensory quality, on the composition, on the nutritional quality of the fruit. And as I said, as the water availability decreases and we see more and more oil that is coming from saline irrigation, these should be taken into consideration. Also, as we're considering the nutritional security of many people who consume that. So I want to thank collaborators and lab members. We're all women. You can see that's nice. And thank you for listening. Any questions? So it's hard to tell. That's the problem with the nutritional value. So you gain something at one point and on one aspect, and you lose something on a different aspect. So you really have to go between, how do you go between the drops? This is how they say that. And you have to decide. Generally, I would say that the increased level of polyphenols and tocopherols are more beneficial than the decrease in fatty acid, the desirable fatty acids. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the next presentation, we will address additional aspect of using low quality water and this the effect on soil, and how to remediate sodic soil, and the presentation will be given by Guy Levy from Volcani Institute. Soil properties and tree performance in olive grove irrigated with poor quality water, effect of reclaiming with inorganic amendment.
Okay, good morning. Morning. Yep. So, in the name of sustainability, as we heard from the keynote presentation this morning, which is very important these days, so my talk will focus on soil rather than on the crop, giving the soil the credit due to the medium in which actually the crops grow. So in Israel, we've got a number of water resources where you can see that the most dominant one is the treated wastewater, and its volume and amount allocated to agriculture increases rapidly, and it's expected to get in 2050 to 67%. Now it's even more than 50%. Now, treated wastewater, by its name, means that it is poor quality water that has been treated. But the problem with the treatment is that it deals only with the organic components and does not change or hardly changes the inorganic components, mainly the salinity, which remains very high. As you can see from this table, the sodium content is high, and subsequently the sodium adsorption ratio is more than double than in fresh water. And this implies that irrigating intensively with such type water will affect the soil and may cause damage, which eventually is also reflected in the crop. So what can irrigation with treated wastewater cause? It can cause soil solidification, and the expression for soil solidification will be the term sodium adsorption ratio, SAR, which is basically the ratio of sodium concentration to the concentration of the divalent cation, calcium and magnesium, divided by 2 under the square root. And this is, by this term, by the value of this term, we determine whether there is a danger of solidification to the soil or not. And what does solidification cause? It causes destruction or degradation of soil structure. It causes soil aggregates to break down more easily, and destruction of macro and micro pores consequently, because if we destruct the aggregates, we've got smaller aggregates which lead to the formation of smaller and narrower pores, and in turn, they lead to reduction in soil water infiltration and water movement, and can cause waterlogging and oxygen level, and affect oxygen level availability for the plants. And as a general rule, we refer to SAR5 as a problematic value. So we would like to keep the SAR of the soil below 5. And even if it's below 5, we would like to keep it as low as possible. But 5 is considered as the threshold value. Now, what does soil solidification, how does it affect the olive trees or any other tree? It can cause hypoxia, it can cause decrease in root growth and reduction in tree yield. it may cause the waterlogging, will cause lack of oxygen and etc. and all the other, I'm not much of a plant specialist, all other bad things to the plants. And results have shown already that long-term irrigation with treated wastewater causes a decrease in yield over time. These results refer to avocado and citrus in clay soils, and we can see that already after 3-4 years of irrigation with treated wastewater, the yield in treated wastewater is below that obtained when irrigation is with fresh water. Now in orchards, the sensitivity of the soil to the poor quality water is greater than in field crops for a number of reasons. First of all, the volume of soil irrigated is constant and relatively small, so it means that we apply a large volume of water to a relatively small volume of soil, thereby enhancing the adverse effect of the water quality on the soil. Another issue is the lack of soil cultivation is practiced in field crops. So if you do not cultivate the soil, you do not make aggregates, you do not air the soil, etc. And that's, on the long term, is a bad thing. And there's also the absence of crop rotation, which also is known in field crops as a good thing for maintaining good soil structure. So our research hypothesis was that if we take inorganic amendments that contain calcium and magnesium as divalent cations, we can reduce soil sodicity because they will replace the presence of sodium, and thereby we can get away from soil sodification, maintain soil structure, and subsequently improve or not harm the crop. Now we went into an existing olive grove that has been irrigated with poor quality water, treated wastewater for many years. For example, in 1920, the SAR was 30. Remember, I said 5 is the threshold value. We had, all in all, 8 treatments, of course, control, and then 3 treatments whereby we added the amendments through the irrigation system. So it was basically amending the soil during the irrigation season. We used added calcium chloride or magnesium chloride or sulfuric acid. Now, sulfuric acid does not have a divalent cation, but being an acid, it induces acidic conditions in the soil. If the soil contains calcium, as was our soil, then sorry, not calcium, contains lime, calcium carbonate, then the calcium carbonate will dissolve, and we will have available calcium cations to replace the sodium. In addition, we had 4 treatments with slowly dissolving salts, gypsum, calcium sulfate, which we added to the soil surface prior to the rainy season, expecting the rainwater to dissolve the gypsum. And one thing was, as I said, the gypsum was spread on the soil surface. In the second treatment, it was spread, and thereafter tilled to a depth of 10 centimeters. The other treatment was polyhalite, which is basically a slow-release fertilizer containing a lot of potassium and a lot of calcium. And we thought that in addition to mending and remediating the soil, we can also add some potassium, which is always good. And here we have the polyhalite in 2 forms, in granular, relatively big chunks, or powder form, which may affect the rate of dissolution of this mineral. Okay, now look at the results or the highlights of the results of this experiment, first of all, let us look how did our treatments affect soil salinity. First of all, we can see a trend of fluctuation in the EC level depending on the season. At the end of the irrigation season, November, the values are high. At the end of the rainy season, March, values are lower. By and large, we have a trend of reduction in the EC of the soil. This is if we look over the years of the experiment. If we zoom in into the EC level at the end of our experiment, November 23, we can see that actually the highest ECs were obtained with gypsum and magnesium chloride, so the amendments resulted in high EC values, which are not good, but the calcium chloride emerged as the most effective treatment in reducing the EC of the soil profile to a depth of 90 centimeters. You can see it from the orange line, the most left in the figure. Looking at the SAR values, just a second, I think I jumped to one. It's here. Looking at the SAR at 2 depths over the entire period of the experiment, we can see that the 3 most ineffective treatments, the figure on the left were the control, the polyhalite in the powder form, and the sulfuric acid. They were the least effective, and the other treatments were more or less with the same efficiency. If we go to the 30 to 60 centimeter soil layer, we can see that at this deeper layer, mainly calcium chloride was again the most effective treatment, and leading to a significantly lower SAR than the one obtained in the control. If we zoom in on the SAR at the end of the experiment, looking at the different values along the soil profile, it is very clear that the calcium and magnesium chloride, the treatments that were applied during the irrigation season were the most effective in maintaining low SARs. And gypsum was also significant. You can see on the one from the control. Another measure that we looked at was aggregate stability. As I said, increasing of sodicity in the soil affects badly, has a bad adverse effect on the stability of the aggregates. And we can see here the median aggregate size with time over 10 minutes. In the method, there are numerous methods. The one we looked was using a particle size analyzer, which gave us the distribution of aggregates over time. And then we used, as I said, the median aggregate size as the parameter to compare the effectiveness of the various treatments. And we can see that the gypsum treatments were significantly higher than the one obtained in the control, 97 microns versus 82 microns. So the amendments proved as effective in maintaining greater stability. Looking at yield, on the left-hand side, we see the yields over the years. Alternate bearing is very, well, I mean, it's easily shown here, but we did not see any significant difference in yield between the various treatments that we studied. If we look at the mean cumulative yield, so the yield, summing up the yields over the years, then we see a clear trend whereby the winter treatments, the treatments where we apply the slow dissolving salts on the soil surface, gypsum and polyhalite, were more effective in maintaining higher yields than the other treatments. Yet I must, before ending, I have to have a word of caution, and that regards the calcium chloride treatment, which was a treatment that was proven effective in a number of the parameters that we looked at. Calcium chloride in combination with treated wastewater can cause clogging of the drippers. The organic matter, dissolved organic matter present in the treated wastewater, even at low levels, can combined with the calcium, settle down and close the drippers, meaning that actually the amount of water coming out is much less than the one we planned. And that transpires into less water available to the trees and the subsequent effects on the yield production. So to conclude, the application of polyhalite, gypsum and calcium resulted in significant decrease in the SAR compared with the control, which is what we were aiming at. And the SAR that we got was below the threshold value which I mentioned, being 5. Gypsum application yielded the highest aggregate stability compared to all other treatments. Gypsum contributed to the highest yield in the years 2019 to 2023. Again, this one wasn't significant, but the trend was pretty obvious. And as I mentioned just before, calcium chloride is effective, but can cause to this plugging of the drippers, and therefore its addition requires adjustment of the amount and way of application to avoid this adverse phenomena. Thank you, and I want to acknowledge the contribution of the funding agencies, ICL, CFPN, and the chief scientist of the Ministry of Agriculture of Israel, and also that of Metza Plus, the company that provided us with the irrigation equipment, and to all the people that helped us in the execution of the experiment. We were lucky and managed to publish our findings in applied water management. So thank you very much. You are touching on a sore point. Gypsum is indeed known as a very effective soil amendment. Unfortunately, the main source for gypsum in Israel comes from ICL factory, where they produce the phosphoric acid and gypsum as a byproduct. Now, unfortunately, that byproduct contains some radioactive and other pollutants, which led the Ministry of the Environment or Environment Protection, whatever they're called today, to ban its use. We are trying, and when I say we, it's Arnon and other people are trying, as well as, of course, ICL, because they have got this mountain of gypsum stacked next to the factory, to change this decision of the ministry, because we did some preliminary tests and we showed that the levels are within the permitted range. So there's no danger neither to the operator, nor to crop, nor to the people that work in the field, etc., from these radioactive elements and other contaminants, but still we haven't managed to convince them. We hope that one day we will. An alternative source of gypsum in Israel is from the electrical power station powered by coal, where you have this prevent sulfuric acid from getting into the atmosphere, but this is a cleaner source of gypsum, whatever more desirable. It's been taken by the building industry, roads, construction, etc., so it's not available to agriculture. The major attraction of using gypsum is that it is a byproduct, and its cost involves only transportation. Now, if you have to bring it, say, from the US, Europe, I don't know, it won't be cost effective. Sorry? Well, the potassium, the amounts of the potassium that you add are relatively small. Gypsum, we're talking about adding 3 to 5 tons per hectare. Which is quite a lot.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's a good point. We need to do something with this issue. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Neil Killman that this study was done in his orchard, as well as many other studies that we are doing. So Neil, thank you. The last presentation for today will be given by Kate Raphael from the University of Haifa, the cultivation of olive tree and the olive oil industry in Palestine from the late Mamluk period to the end of British Mandate, trend of growth and decline. So she's taking us 200 years back to learn what happened here in Israel in the past.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm an archaeologist and a historian, so I promise charts are not going to be a problem in the presentation. So what we'll do today is look at the fluctuations in olive cultivation over approximately 500 years from the late Mamluk period. And the Mamluks, their capital is going to be in Egypt, in Cairo. But they will rule all over the modern state of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, modern state of Syria, and southeast Turkey. They will rule the region for about 250 years. And the presentation will end in the British Mandate, which is 1946. In between, we have 400 years of the Ottoman Empire. The project was funded by a very generous fund from the ERC, the European, and it is run by Professor Guy Bar-Oz, who heads a project called the Bustan Tree. It looks at indigenous trees of the region, fruit-bearing and non-fruit-bearing trees. It's been going on for about 3 years. And has 2 more years to go. The photograph of the team here is taken in the Galilee in about the year behind us. The tree behind the team is about almost 1,000 years old. So let's begin. The following project was conducted by Professor Yotam Tepel in Nachal Zeitan in the Negev. You can see the area that is marked with rectangular. That is the location of Wadi Zeitan, where they found a number of trees and an irrigation system which date to the Roman period, all through the Byzantine and the early Islamic period, which is around about the 4th till the 7th century. The area of Shifta, the cultivation stretched over approximately 500 hectares. We're talking about mainly vineyards and olive groves. And then amongst the group of trees that remain, the living specimens, there's 2 trees that actually bear fruit. And what Dr. Yotam Teper and Guy Barros decided to do is to actually excavate, like archaeologists excavate ancient sites, but to excavate the substructure of the root system and take all the samples that you do in regular archaeology, but apply it onto the trees here. And this is what it looks like. The entire root system was excavated. Sections were taken, and from those sections, samples were taken, carbon-14 for dating, pollen, and OSL, to give further crossing with the carbon-14 dating, as well as the samples taken for genetic analysis. So the trees here in Wadi Zeitan, the living specimens date to around about 1465, which is the Mamluk period. And the entire cultivation and agriculture systems of Wadi Zeitan ended around about the 10th century. Shifta was abandoned slightly beforehand. And it seems, if we look going backwards, it seems that what gave those trees an extended life is partially the topography of the Wadi. Those trees are protected from the wind and much of the sunshine during the year. And the ancient irrigation system that wasn't maintained, but it is built according to the topography to catch the runoff, the dams that were set up. So although it wasn't maintained, it still provided enough water for the trees to continue. So the trees were planted around about the 4th, 7th century, but what we see today dates back to the end of the 15th century. Continuing from the 15th century and looking at the entire region of Palestine that, as I said before, was under the Mamluk reign, you can see that trees are cultivated in the area of Galilee, marked by Tzfat. Nablus is a dominant cultivating and oil-producing area and will remain so all the way through to the 20th century. And then you have the area of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Hebron, which are also very dominant in the cultivation and in production of olive oil. Ramle actually marks the edge of the cultivation zone, the coastal area, which was very highly cultivated with olive groves during the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th century. You can see that olive groves are completely absent from the coastal area in the medieval period. And the coast during almost 400 years is going to be highly cultivated by cotton and sugarcane. Both crops require heat, humidity, and large amounts of water. It is important economically to stress here that cotton and sugarcane were dominated by the Sultan high-ranking officers. They were not crops that were cultivated by the ordinary falachim, the farmers in the villages. They needed a very costly infrastructure as opposed to olive trees, which did not need irrigating canals, and the industry itself was already well established and did not require large amounts of funding. So there's also a very neat and clear cut section between the funding that you need for cotton and sugarcane as opposed to the traditional methods of growing olive trees, which were run by ordinary farmers, their families, and the villages. If we move on to the end of the 16th century, we have incredibly detailed data regarding the number of trees cultivated, as well as the number of villages that are growing olives. And we can still see that the Galilee and the area of Nablus, as well as Ramle, the area of Jerusalem and Hebron, are still dominant cultivators of olive oil. In 1596, there's 1.4 million trees that are cultivated throughout the regions that you see on the map, and they're cultivated by about 390 villages. The data here comes from the Ottoman tax registers, meaning that there's clerks going into each and every village, counting the number of trees in order to get the accurate number of tax that each farmer has to pay. So you can actually calculate how many trees each and every village grows in the region, which is extraordinary. You don't have such data throughout the period that we're looking at, but it gives you a good base for to see how the crop will develop and change. If we look at the numbers for each district that is growing olives, again, we're still in 1596. You can see that in Nablus you've got just over 600,000 trees. Jerusalem, El-Quds comes second with just under 500,000 trees. And then as you're moving west towards the coast, the number decreases dramatically. In the area of Atlit, which is just south of the modern city of Haifa, you've got 4,400 trees. In the area of Gaza, you've got 2,000 trees. But this is about to change. Usually we, as historians and modern scholars, archaeologists, you always look at the intervention of the regime as something that is bordering corruption and the abuse of farmers. But when it comes to olive trees, we actually have several examples of the benefits of the intervention of the regime. And here we have this very good-looking, elegant man is Ibrahim Pasha, and it is this story is incredible because he wasn't here for very long. He was here for a decade. His father was the ruler of Egypt, but he himself conquered Palestine and ruled it from 1831 to 1841. And in those 10 years, he makes this incredible step. He decides to plant 300,000 olive trees on the coastal plain of Acre. I don't know if he really loved olive oil, if he had excellent advisors. I couldn't reach the root of this change that he makes, but it changed the landscape of olive cultivation along the coast. It's one of the first signs we see of the return of olive trees and olive cultivation to the coast. Anybody that goes and travels in the Galilee today, it's the Western Galilee is one of the richest and most beautiful olive landscapes in the country. And it seems that he actually established or initiated that step. About 50% of the olive oil that is produced in Palestine during the 19th century goes into the soap industry. So we're not talking about surplus oil, we're talking about a crop which is driven by the soap industry. A lot of the soap is going to Southern Europe, Egypt, and some of it stays in the Levant. The tax system changes for the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So the accurate detail that I showed you before for the 16th century no longer exists. But we have some detail about the number of olive oil presses. So we can see that in the 16th century, we've got 34 olive presses. 300 years later, we've got 370 oil presses, which is like a boom industry in the olive oil production and in the soap industry. This young gentleman here with the tie, he hardly looks like the regular industrial type, but the towers around him are towers of soap which are produced in Nablus, and it was the third largest industry in Palestine in the period that we're looking at. Some decline. So we're not looking at a constant growth or a steady growing industry. There are some periods where we see a drop in the number of trees and a drop in the number of production of olive oil. One of the periods is the First World War, where there's the shortage in fuel and there's felling of trees, not only olive trees, but also carob and pistachio trees are being felled in order to produce fuel, coal for train systems. When you, as a historian or an archaeologist, when you have one a piece of evidence and it looks a bit iffy or shaky, so you have to find another source to cross it with. And we've got the other source. We've got a counter order issued by the British in 1917 when they replaced the Ottoman regime, where they put very, very high fines and very severe punishment on anybody that goes out to fell carob, pistachio, and olive trees. And it seems that the British were very much aware of the importance of olive trees and the production of olive oil to the economy of the area and to the tradition of the population. This is just a regular chart showing the changes, the numbers of olive trees. So we're going from 1.4 million in 1596 to a steady 4.7 all the way up to 6 under the British mandate. It's important to say here as well that here the British mandate really comes forward to the farmer. They sell seedlings and plants at a very low cost to encourage farmers to plant olive groves. They also take into consideration years of drought and crop failure and reduce the taxes in years that are hard on the farmers. The data here is almost as good as the data that we have here 400 years earlier. It comes from an agronomist whose name is Ali Nassouh, and another agronomist called Asaf Gur. Strangely enough, they were both born in Jaffa in the early 19th century, and we don't know if they knew one another, although it seems that in British Palestine, two agronomists that specialized in olive cultivation, they probably did. They both worked for the British Department of Agriculture in Palestine. This is the front page of Ali Nassouh's book, which is called Sajarat el-Zaytun, the olive trees. and Asaf Gould has a publication, a book that is called Hazait, the olive tree. They both have mass information about every aspect of cultivating olives. And Ali Nasuch did his work in a similar manner to that of the clerks in the Ottoman Empire who went and collected taxes, but he did it for his own research olive trees, and he went to each and every village in Palestine and measured the acreage of olives. So you can calculate the number of trees according to the acreage and the detailed information that he left behind him. So olive trees continue to grow, a steady number of trees in the 1930s and the 1940s. Again, most of the olive oil that is produced here is still going to the soap industry, and although we have already new oils that are making their way into the local kitchens, olive oil is still a very prominent, it still maintains a very prominent place in the local kitchens, but it will be reduced, and I think it will kick back in around about the late 1970s, late 1980s. Olive oil will regain its importance and its health, as Zipora had remarked in her own presentation. For many years it was not acknowledged. It was used only by the falachin. Most Israelis, most of my friends, they used the regular soya oil on their salads. Nobody that I grew up with used olive oil, and I am ancient, but not that ancient. Returning to Nachal Zeitan, those trees that are 500 years old, nearby us here in Shifta, they were, what you see in the photograph here is a salvage nursery where they're propagating, the trees are propagated from those specimens in Nachal Zeitan. The research is continuing. Some of it has been published. If you look up Yotam Tepper and Guy Bar-Oz, Daphna Langot, they have published the finds from Nachal Zeitan, and the new excavation of the tree in the Galilee in Zipora will, no doubt, the publication will also come out shortly. I would like to thank you for staying. I know your stomachs are grumbling, so thanks a lot.